Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining us is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, Adam Tooze, this week in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So this week we have one data point to jump off from, and that data point is 400 billion, as in $400 billion, which is the amount of money that U.S. tech firms will spend this year on AI infrastructure.
Now pushing the boom in AI investing, with Microsoft, Alphabet, and Meta all outlining plans to spend tens of billions a quarter to develop
billions
AI.
of dollars into infrastructure to ramp up artificial intelligence. Some projections show that spending may be fueling nearly half of this year's estimated GDP growth. AI is having a disproportionate impact on the markets, too, especially in recent months.
That amount of spending is, of course, vast on its own, but it's projected in the years ahead to climb even further by 2028. Expectations are that spending on AI infrastructure of this kind could hit or exceed $3 trillion. That's by 2028. Adam and I have been talking about doing an occasional series on AI and its meaning for our world of politics, our world of economics. Next week, we're going to get to the obvious question raised by this data point, which is, will this pay off? What is the basic economics of AI at this moment? But first, this week, we wanted to address AI as a technology more generally, trying to examine what exactly it is, maybe the more general political economy involved in this growing technology. And to start off with, Adam, in thinking about what kind of technology AI is and reading about it, a phrase that has come up in my own reading is general purpose technology. This has been used to describe the sort of technology that AI is. And I'm curious what the implications of that designation are. I mean, what would that mean for the economy if this were in fact a general purpose technology? What are the precedents for that kind of thing, and what should we expect to come out of it?
Yeah, this is a great place to start, I think, because it takes us to the heart of how economists are trying to figure out how AI relates to the economy and to the familiar history of economic development and technological change. That's really at the heart of this, what might seem like a kind of technical question of designation. So general purpose technology is a phrase that economists came up with to describe, in some ways, a puzzle. So technologies that were both conspicuous, in some ways epoch-defining, very pervasive, but also in their immediate impact on the economy, sometimes, shall we say, subtle, if barely hard to detect. And yet over time, they become indispensable and almost impossible to imagine the world without. So the sort of thing we're talking about is steam power or electrification or the internal combustion engine or semiconductors. And the idea is that AI might be that kind of technology. It's worth noting that, other innovations you might think of, I don't know, like iron-hulled ships or flight or space travel aren't on that list. That isn't because the economists are saying they don't matter. It's just that in their case, they're much more direct in their impact. They change an industry or create an industry altogether. Or if you're talking about particular types of tools in industrial manufacturing, for instance, that isn't a general purpose technology. It doesn't mean it's not a powerful technology. It's just in its impact very specific. So the list is short. And frankly, what's really striking about the debate about AI is there isn't really very much disagreement. I think practically everyone agrees that AI clearly is of the type of general purpose technologies. In other words, it's changing things very dramatically. It's very pervasive. It may take some time for its full effects to be felt, because what is typical of general purpose technologies is it takes time for entire infrastructures to be built, societal arrangements to be shifted to accommodate and ultimately make best and full use of, digitization. It's a long way from the first microchip to the entire logistical system built around Amazon, for instance. But in due course, one does enable and make possible the other. The question with AI is not so much, is it a general purpose technology, but is it something more than just a normal general purpose technology? Is it something hyper? is it in some senses the end point of all technological development because it's a technology about technology? Because what we're doing here is applying technology to thinking, which is the source of technology. And so that then raises a bunch of other questions. I think most economists are agreed that this is a normal general purpose technology. The question is, could it be some sort of unprecedented general purpose technology? And if it were, it would again impact at the very heart of economic thinking about technological change. And this goes to a weird aspect of economic thinking about economic development, which is you might think that would be at the heart of all economic models. But if you look at standard classical, neoclassical, mid-20th century, 1950s, 1960s neoclassical growth models in which capital and labor are combined to produce output, which grows over time because labor becomes more productive because you add more capital, or machines are more productive because you add more labor, those models don't actually predict sustained growth. They predict convergence to some kind of level of GDP after which growth subsides. And the way that technology figures in standard growth models is as the factor which enables capital and labor together to be increasingly productive over time. This is the notion of total factor productivity. In some models, there's even something called endogenous technological change, which means that as you grow, you acquire more resources to develop more technology, which is clearly true. We build bigger and bigger labs. And as those labs expand, you get access to greater and greater technologies. And if we were properly measuring, which we don't generally do, the impact of this, we would actually see accelerating growth over time. And so the real kicker here is that if AI turns out to be an R&D enhancing technological innovation, like the invention of the big lab, for instance, then all of a sudden we might actually see not just a one-off period of improved growth and higher GDP, which is what we've seen with general purpose technologies in the past, but a quantum leap into an era in which, because we can think faster, we can innovate faster. And so the extra juice that innovation adds to economic growth is itself growing over time. And so rather than having diminishing returns in research, which is ultimately the biggest nightmare of conventional economic thinking, that the low-hanging fruit have all been exhausted, that Gordon thesis, we would in fact be in an era in which through AI, we can in fact increase the pace at which we innovate progressively. So we could leap quite suddenly to a growth rate of, people talked about, growth rates of 20% per annum in a sustained way. Because we're not just getting smarter, we're getting smarter at getting smarter. There is a second level. And that's really what the debate in AI is about. And when people say there's a debate going on right now, is AI a normal technology? What they're saying is it a normal general purpose technology? Or is it this other type of break in historical development?
Yeah, it's good to know that there is no dispute about it being a general purpose technology. It's just this sort of second question of it, whether it is something unprecedented entirely. I mean, it sounds like in that scenario, actually growth is a problem, or like sort of runaway growth could itself, like all of a sudden we have different economic issues that we never even had to contemplate before.
That is, I think, something we should explore in this series down the line, because some of the more fantastical developments of that idea are truly radical in terms of shifting the balance between capital and labor. There are interpretations of the hyperscaling right now, which are really a kind of economic end times. Like if we are close to the paradigm break, then there really isn't any amount of money it wouldn't be worth spending to get advantageous position when we enter this new era. Anyway, that's for future conversations. But I think on general purpose technology, that boat sailed. This clearly has, that at least seems to be the conventional wisdom on this at this moment.
Yeah, I suppose anytime the prefix hyper is being evoked, the potential for something ominous is there. But yeah, I guess maybe to get grounded again for a second. I mean, it does seem like a lot of these conversations about the future of AI are sort of extrapolating from its existing growth. But I wonder whether the trajectory of AI improvements is itself changing. I mean, in some sense, is it already slowing down? I mean, that seems to be the suggestion from some of the most recent AI services that have been released. I mean, are we already seeing diminishing marginal returns from this technology?
Well, this is a really hot item of debate within the AI community, and I'm, as a novice, kind of reading my way into this, struck by the intensity of this debate. The question is whether the scaling laws apply or whether we're going to hit a wall. Those at least are two of the terms which are being used to discuss this. So the idea of the scaling laws was launched by an internal paper by OpenAI and DeepMind in 2020, which shows that model performance on tasks like language modeling improves smoothly with more data, more parameters, and more compute. And this is the sort of simplest kind of vision of how to expand the AI system and the functioning of the models. Simply add more of those three components. And the debate within the AI community is not simply about those laws as, descriptions of AI as a technology, but as management principles. If you are OpenAI, is the smart thing to do simply to scale up those three inputs to the model? More parameters, more data, and more compute. Is that the way in which you grow? And there has been a series of arguments within the community about trying to optimize that. So, if you like, a technology of the technology describing AI's growth, can you actually add relatively more data relative to the parameters that you're trying to model? Is really the most sensible thing to simply double down on number crunching capacity. This is one of the arguments that's going on. And the next argument is, if you do optimize, do you still ultimately hit a wall? And very senior people like Meta's chief AI officer are convinced that even if it's not a wall that we're headed towards, there is, at least on the current configuration of AI models, a series of constraints which mean that simply trying to estimate more parameters with more data and more computing power are not going to allow the industry and the models as they're currently set up to jump into a qualitatively new type of AI. And he is arguing that the fundamental problems are that you're not essentially incorporating in data anything other than text. This is fundamentally a text-based form of modeling. You're not retaining enough data as memory, so you're not building up enough experience within the models. And the agenda of simply ramping up more and more computing power is not going to allow you to break free of these constraints. And so, to double down on this point, this question you're asking as a kind of academic question is then within the industry itself turned into essentially a kind of management question. If it is true that we face diminishing returns rather than just being able to scale up, what should we do? And that then informs corporate strategy, with players like Meta trying to diversify the range of data that they feed their models with, for instance, so as to give them more real world relevance, or shifting the models from simply estimating predictive algorithms. So what you're trying to do is predict the most likely next token, the most likely next word, to trying to get the models to think in terms of actually constructing images of the world, models of the world, not just, as it were, individual predictions of what comes next in the sentence against the backdrop of all the other sentences which the model is processing. But here is my vision of what the world is, so as to be able, in a more, if you like, normatively grounded or empirically grounded way, to move to more intelligent statements and predictions and interactions with the world. So rather than a bit by bit, sentence by sentence, question, answer, interaction, to move towards a kind of Weltbild, a kind of vision of what the world is as mirrored within the AI. So these are the kind of conversations which are not, again, they're not abstract academic conversations. They are shaping the investment strategies and billions of dollars of investment in firms like Meta.
Okay, wow. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a fundamental difference in those approaches that you're describing, and whether the existing AI companies are they not path dependent at this point on the kind of models that they've already created? Can they actually shift course to the kind of approach, this latter approach you're describing, which almost seems to me more of like what we think of as a human mind rather than the kind of language model that AI has been based on until now? I mean, this does seem like it almost like...
I think they're just doing things in parallel at this point and then trying to relate them to each other. I mean, the level of resource that's been mobilized, in the hype around this boom is such that you don't have to make tough choices if you can make a plausible investment case. And so we'll talk much more about that, the economics of this in a subsequent segment in this series. But certainly there are struggles going on within organizations conceptually about what the right strategy is to pursue, which makes this very much more path dependent and historical, if you like, than one might think, right? As you say, like there are a series of choices, a series of wagers being made on the optimal direction to go down. And we can think back to the shock at the beginning of this year of DeepSeek suddenly emerging with this claim that they were producing a very powerful model with much more modest compute components in their three-factor combination of data parameters and compute power. So everything to play for, I think. And first of all, I think it's a matter for those of us who are lay people to develop some rudimentary understanding of what the stakes in these arguments actually are that are going on within the big players.
We will take a quick break right here, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about AI. So to take this question of what kind of technology AI is from a slightly different angle, I'm curious if it would be helpful to think of AI in terms of its precedents or analogies technologically, comparing it with fossil fuels. I mean, basically thinking of AI as an extractive technology. I mean that in the kind of micro sense of the direct environmental damage that AI causes in terms of the energy required to do all this compute that you're describing. But yeah, also in the macro sense of the way it might be centralizing power in certain firms or certain countries versus others, and the ways that it's maybe creating inequality or reproducing inequality. I mean, is AI an extractive technology, and is it useful to think of it that way?
I mean, I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, I appreciate the polemical force of this kind of argument because, extractive industries are contentious, are bad. In some ways, extraction is perhaps less ethically sound as a mode of economic activity than production, I guess, or manufacturing, or maybe commerce even. There's something violent that's inherent in this. And I mean, on the one hand, fine, that may be illuminating. It's difficult to see why that makes AI distinctive, like it's a thing in the world. And so, the phrase from Kate Crawford's book from 2022 is AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. It's made from natural resources and human labor. I mean, which is, I think, as much as to say artificial intelligence is in the world. I mean, it's made of things like natural resources and labor. Of course, it's not just about intelligence as a disembodied thought process, but, as fueled by material inputs. And we're going to need a lot of energy and water for cooling and some land to install these facilities in. I mean, I think the two aspects of this where it's worth digging in a bit more and where it could be illuminating is it reminds us that labor is involved. And people might think that's strange because first and foremost, we think of AI as displacing labor. But the mind-boggling fact is that none of these models would operate in the vaguely human way that they do unless they were anchored in something what I understand the industry calls ground truth. And ground truth is a phrase they've gotten from digital geography, from GPS. And ground truth is a data point in a GPS system, which isn't just something you've seen from a satellite or constructed through extrapolation, but where some person has been on the ground to confirm that mountain is there where that mountain is said to be, or that building is where it's supposed to be, right? It's been checked out by a person. And the the human-like quality of the LLM models that we know in large part is owed to and essentially depends on coding, like massive amounts of coding of text where basically you're saying, cat, animal, and then you place it further and then you associate it with an image. So somebody has gone along and basically the big firms have employed millions of people. It's hard to get a precise estimate, but we're talking a large fraction of the online transient digital service workforce is doing this. And is basically just going through and anchoring the AI's manipulation of symbols in relatively crude, human-approved cat, furry animal, sits on people's lap, pet, that chain. Now, the model can pick up the way those chains appear, but at some point, the whole thing has got to be anchored in a ground truth, which a human puts in. So there is a huge amount of hidden labor. And when we get to this thing called alignment, in other words, if the model concludes that one way of solving a problem would be genocide, the model is now flagging that that's a problematic thought, shall we say, a bad thought that it's sort of inhibited about producing. That is a human input. So this is the content moderating that's going on to achieve alignment. And it's like mind-bogglingly crude in its conception epistemologically and politically, right? Because that's where all of the normative political work is in some ways going on. And of course, many of these judgments are relatively simple, but others are by no means simple and hugely culturally specific. And for that, there is a huge amount of underpaid human labor being used. People's brains, people's basic wiring that says cat, furry, pet, cute, that's being used. And then the other thing that's being used is, of course, the huge volumes of text, which the companies, in what is surely one of the most gigantic acts of, well, they would insist, of course, it's all fair use, but a whole series of lawsuits that have been brought against Meta, that have been brought against Apple and other players in this space allege, on the contrary, that the intellectual property of Reuters, the Encyclopedia Britannica, Disney has been plundered for the purposes of constructing these models. And there is, for those of us who have a bibliophile tendency, the nightmarish vision of one firm buying millions of books and literally stripping the pages out and constructing a physical, like a graveyard of books that could be churned through digital scanners and then fed into their system. And whereas like with the Google Book project, fairly serious copyright issues were raised immediately and everyone understood that this was a major struggle over IP. The folks that have done AI, a decade later, have just barreled into this, gone ahead and done it, and are now just waging the legal fight through courts in the United States on a case-by-case basis. And so far are winning. They're winning the cases on the whole because the judges are so impressed by the creative use being made and are therefore labeling this as fair use. But it's quite extraordinary. That, I think, is the most obvious kind of element where we're really talking about extraction. In some cases, you're really treating a book like as though it were a raw material.
I don't suppose there's any video of that kind of tearing apart of those books. I wonder.
There is, yeah.
Oh, God.
And then there was, it's in the Anthropic case, I think. A lot of people were sharing it online.
Ah, okay.
It's kind of nightmarish.
I would have thought that would actually make a difference in a court proceeding, like actually seeing that somehow as an image could be persuasive in some way, but I suppose
think
not.
It works the other way around in that by doing that, you're denaturing it, you're turning it into your own thing, you're making it into a raw material. It's in the same way as like collage artists or whatever are not likely to be sued because you've processed the raw material, right? Some sort of Lockean claim that the book itself was just nature and worthless, and along came civilization and turned it into a digital raw material for AI, and obviously that's cool.
I mean, in some sense, this brings me to my next question, which is that image, I think, feeds into this idea of this technology potentially as something apocalyptic, something that could destroy our social order and would have its own purposes and could, ultimately dominate humanity in some way. And this idea, or that vision, is opposed to another idea of the technology that you are also evoking earlier in this conversation of AI as a normal technology, basically one that would basically be integrated entirely into our existing social order. And there seems to be a kind of debate which of these visions is more plausible. But I was interested in this intervention made by the political science Henry Farrell, who's at Johns Hopkins University. He introduced this together with, I think, other co-authors, but has been writing about this term to describe AI as a cultural and social technology, sort of splitting this difference between these poles in a way. And I'm curious what you make of that. I mean, it seems like he's suggesting it could be something rather than like eliminating society, but could fundamentally reorder our social and cultural life, and basically a sociological intervention in a fundamental way, in the way that sort of markets themselves are a technology that people have introduced and have just adapted to entirely, or bureaucracies are a kind of technology, or print for that matter is a technology that has reordered society. Yeah, I'm curious if you find this plausible, and if so, like what kind of aspects of social life are potentially subject to change by AI? I mean, it does make me wonder whether our fundamental relationship to language or creativity could be changed by this technology, and what could that potentially look like?
Yeah, I think this is exactly the right approach. In fact, I mean, Henry's like one of the wise guys in the. I don't mean wise guy. I mean like one of the wise people in the social science field. He's just like, the guy's just smart. And in fact, when we did our first AI episode, he reached out and said, because I wholeheartedly agree. You asked me a question about this, a while back now, and he reached out and said that he was thinking along similar lines, that I don't get it at some level. And Henry's in that piece in Science, which I really recommend, we should maybe put it in the show notes. Like, their point is, look, let's take all of the silly kind of sci-fi anthropomorphist nonsense off the table here. Like, this is not a human being and this is not human intelligence. But what it clearly is an amazing statistical, indexing, search, generative, it's a symbol generating mechanism, right? It's a bit like synthesizer music or something like that, right? It's a symbol generating mechanism. And we've not had one as powerful as this before, but we have had symbol generating mechanisms before. And they're very, very powerful, and they change societies in lots of different complex ways. And they definitely change our relationship to language in the same way as development of writing changed people's relationship to language, and the development of computers has, and the development of the printed book and the page and so on. So I think this is exactly the way to think about this. And to take off the table, certainly at this stage, all of the really kind of obscure metaphysical arguments about whether this is general intelligence or really human, or whether it has, of course it doesn't. But can a novel, for instance, induce feelings in you? Can you fall in love with a character in a TV series? Of course you can. It's happened to most of us in our lifetimes, right? So could AI, if it has the power to, in a very sympathetic way, continuously affirm various things in you, or spot patterns in your speech pattern or your thoughts, and then sympathetically render them back to you, could it induce different types of emotions in you? Of course it can. I mean, that's the scary thing about symbol systems, whether it's music that can make us cry or feel very sexy or very excited, or battle cries that will take you over the top and to your death, like whilst cheering. Like, these mechanisms work, and this is a very powerful engine for generating those kind of effects. And all of the questions, therefore, are, what's it going to do to our politics? What's it going to do to our social systems? What is it going to do to those of us who are scribes, if you like, in the face of the printing press? How are we going to position ourselves in relation to this? How are we going to define creativity? Is creativity going to be more in the mode of curating, in the mode of selecting, of prompting, of prodding? Because we have this large engine, and what we're trying to do is to figure out how to make it go. We're going to be like racing drivers manipulating a very fast machine, not runners, right? And then people will say, well, Formula One drivers are not sportsmen, until you actually figure out what's involved in going around the corner with 4G forces act on you. What is it going to take to really drive one of these AI engines to the limit of what it's able to do and what it can generate? We don't know yet. We don't really have categories. It's a little bit like the questions that have also arisen with, various other types of remote technology, like, are people who operate drones soldiers? Like, they kill people at distance. Is it really the same thing? They're not really in harm's way themselves most of the time. I think there's going to be a whole series of complex social, cultural adjustments that we're going to have to make around this technology, which absolutely is best thought of as standing in that lineage. And that, after all, is incredibly dramatic. This isn't in any way to downplay it. To say it's not a brain and actually more like the printing press is just to move from essentially unspecified, bizarre metaphysical speculation at this stage to a very realistic and powerful historical comparison, continuation. I keep coming back to the fact in my own encounter with it is that I keep remembering what it was like to first meet Google, and it changed my life. I can show you in the development of my books, the books that were written, the book that was written before Google and the books that were written after, the book that was written before JSTOR and the book that was written after. Like, it totally changed the way in which you could research what you could know. And I remember being, the first time I encountered Google, I remember really just sitting in my office sort of stunned that this had happened, right? That there was a search engine. Because the previous search engine was a large, in Cambridge University, it was a very, very large bound book, which showed you, once you understood the map of the giant library, where to go to find the physical copy of the book. Like, that's what search looked like through to the 90s. Huge mechanized card catalogs they used to have in the Stabi in Berlin, like vast, like churning physical engines that you would search card catalogs with. And this is a technology that allows us to do so much more than that, right? So anyway, it's an animated relational database in some ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not diminishing to describe it as a technology on the level of print as such, or
okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, or bureaucracy as an invention, or markets as an invention. I mean, yeah, we might be not entertaining the apocalyptic scenarios, but these are still world changing in the sense of the human world, world changing concepts. But I guess maybe to examine how this could play out in one specific domain, I mean, the sort of qualitative shifts that are potentially involved. I mean, if we were to look at the economy and the potential power that AI could have in intervening in the economy, could we imagine that, what has been referred to as the long-running calculation debate in economics, which is sort of fundamentally seemed to be what has been cited as the reason that socialism can't work in practice? I mean, this is polemically, been cited in that context. I mean, could AI solve this calculation debate and really help produce a truly planned economy? Is that theoretically possible?
I mean, this is an interesting question. It goes back to 100 years ago, to the aftermath of World War I. And it kicked off then in earnest because the Russian Revolution had created the first Soviet system. And the promise of a certain sort of Marxism coming out of the 19th century had been that it would replace the anarchy of the market with the visible hand of planning and rational control. And all of a sudden, certainly in World War I, where efforts had been made, hugely exaggerated, but nevertheless historically novel, to regulate and plan economies, that then inspired various types of speculative idea about how you were going to run economies in the future. Gosplan got going in the Soviet Union and actually began to compile plans, and then Stalin launched a series of 5-year plans. And against this backdrop, a rather abstract debate began about how you would calculate a plan like that. If you weren't just going to stick a bunch of numbers on a board, how would you calculate it? And could you calculate such a plan? What would be involved in doing so? And how close could it possibly be to something one could describe as efficient or optimal? And the position taken by a variety of economists associated, broadly speaking, with the Austrian school and then later neoliberalism was that there was a sort of fallacy involved in this sort of thinking, a rationalist fallacy, which failed to understand at one level just the sheer complexity of the economic system. The famous example, I think we've discussed it on the show, of like, who in the economy knows how to make a pencil? Like, the answer is no one in the economy knows how to make a pencil. They don't need to, because all you need to know is how you manufacture the pencil at the end. You don't need to know how you make the graphite. You buy the graphite. The market intermediates. And the person who uses the pencil definitely doesn't need to know how to make the pencil, because we're not in the Stone Age where people were manufacturing their own articles. And the vision of the planned economy implied by the socialist planners in the eyes of the conservative Austrian economists was incredibly reductive, because it didn't capture both the complexity of knowledge, how much knowledge was at some level also never going to be formalized because it was tacit, it was in the doing, not the telling. And then also at some level, in the end, there was a problem of preferences and the diversity of preferences and the problem of formulating a coherent set of social preferences that in the end would always tempt people to answer it in an authoritarian way, which is, we in the planning body think you need so many pairs of underwear or so much toilet paper or, so many children's toys, or in the Trumpian, world that we're in right now, your baby doll daughter only needs so many Barbie dolls, right? This is a very anti-Austrian thought, because as we all know, like, kids have a whole variety of different views about what they want, and we have other mechanisms for deciding what they end up getting. And the Austrian view culminated in the view that ultimately the market was this huge, diffuse, at some level could only be a mechanism for economizing on information and allowing society to achieve very high levels of functioning without anyone actually having to spell out how we did it. So it was a kind of almost theology of a market that was untransparent to us, not available to us in any straightforward way. And in fact, the first step you made towards measuring it was the first step towards indulging the silly socialist rationalist fallacy that in the end, having measured it, you'd then also be able to control it. And from the beginning, really, this was a silly, massively oversimplified argument on both sides, right? Because the idea that we actually saw classic rationalist central planners with one big computer crunching the numbers never corresponded to any reality inside socialism or outside it. And on the other hand, the idea that markets were these organic, informal, but nevertheless generic magic wand solutions to this social problem is also like utterly beside the historical point, because there are huge numbers of different types of market, ranging from, a hugely standardized, massively fast-moving futures or commodity exchange where algorithmic high-frequency trading is driving very, very fast movements literally at the level of the microsecond, or a flea market where, you go and just see a staggering array of incredibly diverse things with no price labels on them even often, and you haggle about what it is you might want and what's left over from somebody else's life. Like, those are both markets. They're not functioning in the same way and in a meaningful sense. And the suggestion has been that maybe, AI, maybe formal bureaucracy has always, in fact, in some way been present in markets, because large organizations have to make sensible bets on what they're going to do. Take my university. We have to bet on how many students we're going to get. We're a business organization. We make budgets. We make plans. We organize. We have so many slots. We are functioning as central planners of our little slice of the bureaucratic market, of a bureaucratized education market. And it's already the case that to that extent, AI is working. I was looking at the figures for Amazon, which apparently right now is estimated to, by itself, through its algorithmically driven mechanisms, to account for 13% of American retail spending. All told, online is around a quarter in the US of all retail spending. Now, all of that domain is amenable to various types of algorithmic AI management. And we all know how it's done. They track our preferences in various ways. You don't need to know inside my heart. You just look at the things I click on, and then you pop me a variety of advertising feeds. That's what the entire system of free social media has been based on from the start. It's a giant engine for avoiding the Hayek problem and feeding revealed preferences into algorithms, which then spit out tailored advertising mechanisms. So the answer to your point, very long-winded answer, is The problem was falsely posed at the beginning. It was always far too stark. There was both variety of different types of markets and different types of bureaucracies. And we already live in a world in which large slices of our retail behavior are essentially algorithmically controlled, enhanced, stabilized, and catered to. And in China, it's even larger because the online shopping share there is closer to a quarter to 30%, and it extends through a much wider array of services as well. And all of that is mechanically processed by AI and its mechanisms already.
I guess to return to this question of historical precedents, it seems like maybe the only plausible precedent is the Industrial Revolution, if on some kind of accelerated scale of the kind that we've been talking about. But if we were to look back at the Industrial Revolution, I'm curious, what that would teach us about thinking about work going forward. Clearly work continued after the Industrial Revolution, but in terms of adapting to a new post-AI world of work, what does that earlier precedent suggest we should keep in mind going forward?
Well, I thought this was very interesting, and maybe if we sum up the different phases of this conversation, and I can feel us kind of getting the hang of this conversation a little bit as we go along. If we grant that AI is a general purpose technology, but we insist that it's probably, so far it's meaningful to talk about it as a sort of normal general purpose technology, then you could go back to the steam engine and you could say, well, how is it like the 18th and 19th century Industrial Revolution, except that that's not your only general purpose technology you could ground your comparison on. And that one, after all, was a general purpose technology in fossil fuels and the mechanization of factory work that axed and that hit essentially manual labor. So it touched first and foremost textiles production, and then changed a variety of other industrial manufacturing sectors after that and invented new ones. And that's not what's going on now. And the fundamental difference between the AI revolution and the Industrial Revolution is that this is touching all of the zones of mental and symbolic labor, which became more and more important in the modern economy, not in the first Industrial Revolution, but to pick up another point that you mentioned a minute ago, the late 19th century bureaucratic revolutions, Alfred Chandler's world of the modern corporation, the world of big government, of big states, a world of lawyering, a world of social services, the world of the second Industrial Revolution, and then the interwar period and big bureaucracy. And I think, that's what this technology is really going to impact most. It's a general purpose symbolic cultural technology, to pick up the Farrell point, that is going to revise the mechanisms of office work, of white-collar work that have been so central to modern economies, somewhat to the perplexity of, say, Marxists who were focused on the first Industrial Revolution since the early 20th century, if not slightly earlier in the late 19th century. And that's the kind of historic shift that I think we're going through. And so the question really is this like the development of the telegraph, electricity, the computer, or is this like the invention of the printing press with regard to that kind of work? Because the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, everything afterwards comes within the frame set by the printing press, which was another one of the analogies we've suggested, or another one of the forerunners, the useful historical moments to think with. Or is this more like an organic development of the symbol shuffling, the bureaucratic aids, the electrification of the world that we've seen progressively since the Second Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the digital age? And could the conversation about the wall that AI may be hitting also be a conversation within a firm like Meta about whether they can somehow escape that and move into a technology that would encounter the world, the physical world, in a much more direct way, and would kind of escape the office and the laptop and the desktop and the smartphone and actually go out into the world and thereby become even more pervasive and even more general. But I think that will be the level, I think, at which I would situate this. Did the Industrial Revolution upheave society? Yes. Did it create urban society? Yes. Did it change the nature of politics? Absolutely. Did we need a whole new body of social theory to make sense of that? Sure. But I think the sort of problem that we're dealing with here may have all of those aspects, but it's biting on this more immediate 20th century history, shall we say, for as a shorthand, this 20th century history of the office as the central institution of modernity.
Well, I'm happy to say this is not our last conversation about AI. We will continue next week, digging even deeper into the specifically economic questions. So do come back next week to hear some more about AI. But in the meantime, thanks for listening this week. More soon. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of Foreign Policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.